Welcome. Today we are going to discuss the transatlantic slave trade from the 15th to 18th century. We will be looking at the origins, the agency, the volume, effects on top of that. We'll be looking at economic, political, and cultural. Then have some closing points on this. Let us go. The origins of the transatlantic slave trade obviously go back to the post-classical era. Slavery's been around forever, but we're going to start with the collecting of slaves from this area north of the Black Sea and the Slavic region and transporting slaves to Christian plantations on Crete, Cyprus, Sicily. These were then furthered out into the Western Mediterranean. Well, with the sacking of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453, it made access to these Slavic slaves a little more difficult for Christian slavers. So where are they going to go? Well, let's take a look. They're going to go to Africa. And in Africa in particular, we're going to be discussing certain regions. We have right here West Central Africa. We will also be looking at the Gold Coast, and we will also be looking at the Bight of Biafra for looking for these. The Portuguese were moving their plantation and the Spanish out into the Atlantic islands and encountering. So Africans, right, began to be coming from the regions designated, but were filling the void of the necessary for labor on plantation complexes. So let us move forward. Well, the African slaves, right, were then being transported out into plantation complexes, right, down here you have for the Brazil, and then coming into the 1700s, 18th century, right, the Antilles, the Greater and Lesser Antilles of French and British. The Portuguese, as stated before, moved, right, the technology of sugar production and plantation from Brazil into the Greater and Lesser Antilles. Well, let's take a look at these changes in labor then from Africa. Let's get this video going.
The slave trade develops in this triangular form out of initially Spanish and Portuguese merchants taking Africans to the Atlantic islands. When they needed a labour force in places like Brazil and the Caribbean, it was almost a natural extension to take Africans who they didn't regard as the same as themselves. They didn't see them quite as full human beings. There was slavery in Africa before Europeans arrived, but I think it was a different sort of slavery. It's sometimes described as a more domestic type slavery. It's where slaves were often part of the household, and they weren't treated with the same degree of brutality, of violence, of really being dehumanized. In the form of slavery that we're talking about in the Americas, what we now call chattel slavery, people had their names taken away from them. The slave trade develops.
Okay, so, right, in this video, you see the discussion, or you heard the discussion of chattel labor. This labor changes, right, as stated, right, you're getting the sale, right, of Africans, which were being captured by Africans in Africa and waged wars to get these, which we'll talk about later, but it was chattel labor, right, and these people were being moved across, right, to the Americas and into other regions. And the mode of movement, right, we're on slave ships designated here. You can see clearly in these ships, right, you have crowding and moving. Roughly around 25% of the slave population died before it even hit the Americas. A horrible thing, but it was part of the business for these people moving. So moving forward, let's talk about, we have agency. Well, agency, what do you mean by agency? Who was making this happen? Well, historians have moved back and forth from internal African agency to external agency of Europeans. So let's discuss these two at this time. Okay, in this image, right, you clearly see the use of internal African labor. Right here, it shows an African with a gun moving other Africans. This was normal practices of warfare, right, in Africa during this time, right, leading into the 1500s, 1600s. Private property was not land, but per se they could have people. And the utilization of slaves were more for domestic affairs, but when the utilization on plantation complex, these slaves started being moved out. Clearly a position on internal, right, for the agency. Well, let's take another look at another slide here, which will show us. On this slide here, sorry, coming back, you have shipping. And the shipping of slaves out to a European ship, but on here, notice there's only Africans moving these slaves out to the European ship. Once again, showing internal agency of this movement of slaves and Africans controlling their region at the time. However, right, there is this point of European agency, and this European agency can be discussed in the next couple slides. This slide here from 1642, Dutch emissaries going to the King of Congo. In the image, it clearly shows, right, the Dutch in this position of requesting, right, from the African king right here, slaves from him. It's not showing the Dutch in a position of power, but yet the vice versa. However, there is this external pull for slaves coming from this. It clearly shows, right, more of an external pull for slavery than an internal, but maybe this slide's even both. And this is where the pendulum's kind of going in this. On this next one, right, this is a European painting, but it shows Europeans, right, which is a different painting than the previous one, right, in here, onshore and moving slaves out. Well, the pendulum swung both ways in this, and it clearly demonstrates there is an internal and external, right, movement for slaves during this time. I personally think this slide is better because it shows an external of the slaves being requested of the Dutch king. So we got these slaves, we got external and internal. Mostly it's showing, right, that we must accept that African participation in slave trade was voluntary and under the control of African decision makers. This was not just as the surface level daily, but at deeper levels. Europeans possessed no means, either economic or military, to compel African leaders to sell slaves. Quote from Thornton and Africans Making the Atlantic World, 1400 to 1680. Thornton really goes in the realm of showing that there's a pendulum going both ways. Obviously, moving into the 18th century, the external factor becomes more stronger. So let's take a look now at, right, the movement of slaves. In this slide, you can clearly see a big thing of movement of slaves from Africa here going over, right, to the Americas. An interesting point on this is 95% of slaves went to these two regions, the Caribbean and South America, and only 5% of the slaves, right, went to the Americas. In all, historians now look at it as 11.5 million people moved into chattel labor from this time. So with this movement, what are some effects? Let's look at some effects at this time. First one, economic effects. In this slide, you can see the pricing index of slaves from different regions in Africa. Points to be looking at in this one, I noticed, which were interesting, is you see right here, 1760. Gold Coast is a bigger region than Luanda or Senegal. What does that mean? It keeps moving this region. So African kingdoms in the Gold Coast are trading more with Europeans during the 18th century for Africans, slaves. Let's take a look at another slide. Well, prices within Brazil and the West Indies. So you have prices on this factor. There's a clear cut point at this, and this cut point is right around here. You see prices going up, right, in the Indies, and you see prices going down in Brazil until you hit this point, which this is something else, which is abolition, which we'll talk about later. But the prices, that means production in the West Indies, which we'll take a look at right here. On this slide, was going up right here. Well, this had economic effects, such as you have European powers, Western powers of France and England and the Dutch are gaining over the Spanish, which are losing territories in the West Indies to these people. Also, the Brazil and Portuguese are losing out, right, to the Northern Europeans in this area. It also had ripple effects back in Africa. And these ripple effects in Africa, right, for example, on the Gold Coast, right here, you have, during the 18th century, the price of slaves increased so much that it became more profitable to sell the slaves mining for gold into the transatlantic slave market than to keep them mining for gold. As a result, the source of money for the region became reliant upon the transatlantic slave trade, and thus shifting the area's source of money to external sources, not internal sources, once leading up to the 18th century. So the economic ripple factor is the external pull is greater during the 18th century than the trade of gold. The plantation complex is more lucrative, thus giving more money to Northern Europeans, right, instead of the Iberian powers. Another one here to look at is a political in Western African kingdoms, especially right here in the Congo, right, you have this happens. The increased European need to labor plantations necessitated a large number of captive slaves in slave markets of West Africa. This in turn drove West African kingdoms to extend the slave trade farther into Western Africa to create more wars to bring slaves to the coast. Congo's political decision on slavery, which stipulated that only war captives slaves purchased outside could be sold in the transatlantic slave market. However, 17th century progressed in the 18th century, these rules eroded. And what became is freeborn Congos were not exempt from the transatlantic slave trade. So this created political changes within Africa, too, because of the economic effects. We're going to move forward to some closing arguments. I hope this has been helpful for you. Let us get to that point, and I hope you enjoyed all of this. Well, good afternoon or morning or evening whenever you're watching this. This is to conclude the transatlantic slave trade and its effects. The historical body of work has been for over 50 years, starting with Philip D. Curtin's and looking at the transatlantic slave trade in 1960. With that 50 years of historical work, there have been plenty of arguments on winners, losers, but a lot of people would agree that subtropical Africa was the loser with the demographic shifts out for its economic and cultural losses, whereas in the Americas and later on in other Western regions such as Europe, they have gains. Some have even argued that this has led to the rise of the West, or the tipping point, which is in the 19th century. So big motions, big movements of people, cultural wares, or originating around the plantation complex, needs of labor, shown through this also with sugar in a previous lecture. We could have looked at cotton, we could have looked at coffee, but massive effects. I hope this has been enjoyable and informative the most. And stay tuned, there will be more.